It's my pleasure to host you guys again on Diaspora Live Show. As you know, on this show, we discuss issues that affect Kenyans living abroad. And there's no any other time than now to really sharpen the focus on issues that are affecting Kenyans abroad. It's my pleasure to host you again, Sister Mkawasi Mcharo Hall. You always answer the call when I need to really sharpen the focus on something. I'll never take that for granted. Same to Brother David Ochongi Ogego. It's always a pleasure to host you. You're one of the few Kenyans who are very honest and candid about issues that affect the diaspora. Today, we want to focus on the remittances because the reports that are coming out is that at the end of all this, Kenya is likely to lose more than 20% of its earnings from the diaspora. For a long time, the government has never taken us seriously because of the remittances, because the argument has always been that those are things, social welfare contributions that go to just not help our families. So in any case, we don't have to do anything. The government doesn't have to do anything. So we'll talk about that at length. But before we do that, I would like you guys to react to this rampant reports that Kenyans in the diaspora have been abandoned and left to fend for themselves. The reports are very disturbing, especially what we're seeing in China. Sister Micharo?
Okay, with regards to the abandonment of Kenyans in China, we're talking about the effect of COVID right now. Yes, one thing we know for sure, there are two ways to look at this issue, two truths to look at. The first truth is what has been happening as a result of the crisis. So we have footage that has been coming out that has been showing Africans who are being mistreated in China because they are Africans, because they are Black people. And that is not something that has been exaggerated. That is a fact that is out there. People have been interviewed, and we have seen for sure that there has been a treatment of Africans in a very disturbing way, in a despicable way, in a way that should not be condoned at all. That is one. Two, there is the other side of it, where, not the other side, but the other truth of the same issue, where we know that we Kenyans and fellow Africans have been treated despicably because of systemic racism. And if we're just focusing on China right now, we know that that is a fact. This we know from how Kenyans have been treated in Kenya. Same thing, we have seen footage of Kenyans and their mistreatment by Chinese employees. We know the general outlook, the general notion of what the Chinese have on Black people. Now, this is not to say that Chinese do not get along with Africans. There is the individual level where we know Chinese marry Africans. So on the individual level, this is not something that we're talking about. This is not an issue, because love knows no bounds. Just because, say, for example, we have intermarriages, inter-ethnic marriages in Kenya, doesn't mean that there isn't tribalism.
Yes.
That factor is not the issue. We can't point to, oh, look, we have intermarriages between Chinese and Kenyans who are happy. Therefore, what are you talking about? What we're talking about is systemic racism that has been going on, and it's time that was addressed. And unfortunately, this is racism that directly affects livelihoods. It directly speaks to the economy. We talk about Kenyan workers being mistreated in a Chinese-run industry in Kenya. People losing limbs, and they're thrown out. They're not compensated. And when we look at what this company is doing, this is a company that has branches globally. So this is not a poor company. So how workers are being treated is that systemic racism that we have to talk about. If we want to go about way back into history about the treatment of Black people, then we can go way back and talk about a lot of things. But now, let's just concentrate on what is happening right now, because we have a new type of imperialism and it ought not to be that way. What COVID has done for us, and the cases that are coming out of China, is that it has illuminated what is already in place. It has illuminated the systemic racism that affects the economy, that speaks to the economy, and most importantly, that speaks to the dignity of the African. There never should be a time in our lives right now, post-colonial Kenya, independent Kenya, where we should stand by and condone the indignifying of any of us based on race. Chris, it cuts into the heart.
David,
Skin color should be the reason I'm indignified and I'm not treated well in an industry. What COVID has done is simply unearth what has been there.
David, taking that background that Mkawasi has eloquently laid concerning the treatment of the black race around the world, I speak to the reactions that you've seen from African countries in general, but the Kenyan government in particular.
Oh, good. Very good. Chris, by the way, thank you for the opportunity once again. I echo what Mkawasi just said. What she said is the truth, right? But in addition to that, as far as I'm concerned, it's what are we doing as a people, and what is the responsibility of those that lead our country that should be responsible for the well-being and welfare of our citizens, wherever they are all over the world. And this is one classic example of failure, honestly. I mean, there's no other way to look at it, but failure by our African governments, those that we have put in place to lead us, to help us in a time of need, in time of crisis. And I think on this one, Kenya really did very poorly, relatively speaking, because this last week in Parliament, of all places, when the Minister of Foreign Affairs Permanent Secretary was called to explain what our government is doing to assist or help our people, when he was responding to those questions, he was very dismissive. And one quote that stuck with me is when he said, "Hii ni kelele ya vijana." In other words, don't even worry about that. And they also seem to believe that we are at fault in spite of the systemic racism that we're facing, in spite of what we see in the media, in social media and everywhere, of how Africans, Black people, were being treated in China. There's nothing they can do. That's their law. And it just takes you back. It pulls at your heartstrings that we're on our own. We're Kenyans, we're taxpayers. What we've seen is countries like the United States, or European countries that have sway, that have actually worked with those governments, and they've sent planes, not many planes, maybe 2 or 3, and said, if you come here, we'll bring you home. Our country received a lot of money from donors, from the IMF, World Bank, and other places, donor countries that said, we do know that this is not something you brought on yourself, and therefore we're donating this funding to help you fight the effects of COVID-19, right? So I might not be the sharpest knife on the drawer, but I know if our country received at least in the upwards of 50 billion shillings, then I would expect that some of those funds would be used to try and bring our people home that are in distress. Call the Chinese government and say, this is what we're witnessing. We are going to raise, we're protesting. At least lift a finger and say, we don't appreciate this, even if it's just for the record. And second, I would say, if I was in charge, what I expected is our government then to say, we will charter a plane. Kenya Airways, let it come. It comes there. Let it come and pick our people. Could you please get them to a certain spot, to a certain city, to a certain airport? Help those that can get there, and let's bring our people home. We didn't see any of that, guys. What we saw was a government that was extremely dismissive. On the other hand, if you look at Nigeria, the Nigerians, they stood up and they let the Chinese know that this is unacceptable. And it's after we saw the Chinese government take steps that the government itself, then the Chinese started backpedaling a little bit. The Guineans, I think it's Guinea-Bissau, I forgot what country that was, they arrested some of the Chinese and said, if you're going to do that in China, this is what you should expect here. And I saw similar things in South Africa. You know, so for every action, you should expect some kind of reaction.
So, David, sorry to cut you short, but Mukawasi, you know, many people are arguing that the way the Kenyan government has neglected the diaspora is not something that is new. It's a pattern that has been going on for a long time. One thing I know is that Mukawasi, you and even David, you know, and many other Kenyans, you are at the forefront in developing the diaspora policy. One expects that within the policy that you guys developed, there's some clause that clearly outline the role of the government when it comes to the diaspora. Is there anything in that speaks to the idea of coming to the aid of Kenyans stranded abroad?
Okay, let me say it this way. As far as the policy goes, the only problem with the policies like that is the implementation part. So I'm very sure if there was somebody in charge, whoever it is that's in charge of the diaspora, I've lost track, because there's so many people who are put in charge of that diaspora in different places that I don't know who's doing what.
That's right, yeah.
The implementation part is what is the problem. If there was a concerted and definite implementations of the parts that were put in place, of the suggestions that were put in place, of a policy that was already launched, we would not be talking about this. Because one thing we know is this: there was a committee that was suggested, and this committee was to be the bridge between the government and the diaspora. And we would have been knowing everything that is going on right now. So there wouldn't have been a lapse in knowing what is the diaspora going through and what can the government do about it. Now look, we know that we cannot compare Kenya's economy and the US economy, Australia's economy. We know that these countries that are economically more developed have a better and easier way of getting their people and bringing them back to their countries. But what is lacking for us is that bridge that should have been built a long time ago. These talks we have had for a long time. So yes, the policy is there. It's probably gathering dust. It's probably been gathering dust for the longest time, but the implementation part has been very poor. What has been happening is organizations like Kenya Diaspora Alliance that have been championing issues to do with the diaspora. And I'm sure David has an organization as well that deals with diaspora. These are the groups that are still doing that work. So there is that lapse. Now, is it to say that we don't have ambassadors that have hearkened to the needs of the Kenyans? No, we do. There are some ambassadors out there that have been stellar. I'm looking at someone like Ambassador Serem in China. Quite frankly, the minute that virus hit, even before people in the US started thinking about shutting down anything, she spoke out. And she said, I have my students in Wuhan, and I'm hoping that my students in Wuhan can be either taken back to Kenya or whatever it was that she was suggesting. And it sounded like something rather radical. Whoa, what is she saying? And what I could hear from someone who is in the diaspora was, wow, for the first time I'm hearing an ambassador who's talking about fellow Kenyans as if they were her children, you know. So as the COVID crisis continued to build, she had to keep on figuring out how to address this. So she's one ambassador that I can say, yes, she's been at it for a long time. Now, some people will say, oh, but there are individual Kenyans who are just mean. They just take advantage. They're always against the embassies and the ambassadors. Look at this one. We tried to help her or him, and she's always saying mean things. Well, I say this, you will always find the odd people. You will always find the odd ones out who will always create the kind of problem. But that they are not the issue. We cannot make that the issue. We have to address what we already know for a fact. We have this bridge that needs to be taken care of, that has to be built. And it has to be built by both embassy, government, and the diaspora. And if this bridge was already there, we wouldn't be talking about these issues. Okay.
So, David, as you know, one of the issues that we've had, especially when it comes to Kenyans living abroad, is that one of the reasons why we are neglected is because we are not organized. You have an organization that organizes Kenyans every year. Going forward, because like the Governor Cuomo said, now we have to think outside the box. Because as long as we continue to be divided as a community living abroad, as long as our countries continue to be poor, we will always be molested. Speak to the need now, because the world is going to look different after this. Speak to the need for us now, the diaspora, to finally realize that it's either we organize or we perish separately.
Very good point. And let me just quickly echo to what Mukawasi just said. You know, there's a lot of good people out here, either inside and outside of government, that really mean well. The truth of the matter is that what has happened in this episode is inexplicable to many Kenyans. We don't make sense of it. The governments, especially, I can only speak to our Kenyan government because we're Kenyan, obviously. I think it's something as close to dereliction of duty as you can get, because we have lost that connection. But to your point, I think we're also responsible for it, because in my view, and I think most of you would agree to this, is that we're one of the most fragmented communities in the diaspora that you will ever run across. You, Chris, you've been part of the efforts we've done to really, come together as a community and do some of what maybe the Ethiopians do, for example, or the Rwandese, or maybe, if we can, the Jews, for example. They're very communal people, and they work together as a community. And you can see the strength because of the results that come out of that unity. Going forward, I think, to be honest with you, this COVID-19 could end up being a blessing in disguise for those of us that see that opportunity and seize it and act on it. Meaning, here's an example where now I think the world is going to start turning away from China because of the overdependence on China on just about everything. I mean, literally, 80% of the world production has some connectivity or connection to China. And it's now turning out to be that maybe the world want to divest. We in the diaspora, as you all know, I don't know if you know this, but right now, as we speak, before the COVID-19, the United States and Kenya were starting free trade agreement talks. And part of that, what it meant is that we talked to the Trump administration government and said, please, whatever you agree with, make sure that we as a diaspora are part of that, because we'll be a good bridge. We do not want a situation where Kenya gets into a trade agreement with the United States, for example, but you have people sitting in a boardroom in Nairobi and others in Washington, D.C., and there's no bridge in between that really makes sure they, like Mukawasa said, it's the implementation part of it. We've had a goal that's been out there for many years that we don't really get the full benefit of. So this is an opportunity for us actually in the diaspora, that it's like a confluence. There's the COVID-19, China's being blamed for what happened, right? And there are companies out here, I'm hearing a lot of them that are trying to figure out, where do we move some of our production to? Can we move it to Africa? Where can we get the best value from? And if this trade agreement comes into place, or even if it doesn't, this is an opportunity literally falling on our laps as a diaspora, because we can help drive some of that traffic.
Go ahead, Mukawasi.
Okay, I want to speak to two issues. One, the one what David has just been saying. This thing of including the government, including, say, the U.S. government, including the diaspora, and so that we can be also part of the deal. We know that's a pipe dream, because governments deal with governments, and they're not going to look for a population somewhere to deal with unless we have the kind of power another government has. What they will look for is high net worth individuals. So if they find 20, 50 high net worth individuals in Kenya who are billionaires, yes, they will deal with us. But we're talking about a diaspora that is comparatively, compared to other diasporas, a very poor diaspora. Now, even if we send home, what is it now, 180 million?
Yeah.
Even if that's how much we send home, and it's a lot of money, we are still one of the poorest diaspora communities in the United States. So the United States is not going to be looking at the Kenyan diaspora as an important cog to speak about. So when we recognize our place in there, then we have to start talking about what then is our strength. Our strength still remains our relationship with our government. So that is what has to be worked out. And second thing is, I've heard this thing about we being a disorganized people for so long, and the reason why it's difficult for the government to figure out how to deal with us. Really, that's a lot of nonsense. One, because we're talking about that same remittance that is a lot of money sent to Kenya. And if the government knows they have a population out there, no matter how disorganized that population is, they know that that population annually sends in this much money, and they account for it. They know how much it is. It is their prerogative. It is in their hands, in their door, their responsibility, their office, to figure out how to take care of that community there, that community of Kenya, even if they don't have a single organization, and figure out what are we going to do to make sure that we take care of these Kenyans who do so much for our country with the money they send home. Who's the government?
If I may chime in, just a point of correction, just so you know, Chris in Mukawasi, in terms of trade agreements, I think there's a misnomer where people believe that it's a government-to-government transaction. I'm speaking this from a point of, maybe I shouldn't say this right now, but let me just say it. I'm speaking from a point of connectivity with what's really going on behind the scenes with the Department of State and the trade representative. There is an actual interest in involving the diaspora and having them as what you say, a cog in the trade agreement. So that's not a pipe dream, actually. They're not interested in, well, they are, but they're not looking at multi-billionaires to be a part of that agreement. No. They're interested in the people that are going to drive the traffic. And I'm getting this from official sources coming directly to me. Okay. That's why I say that. Let me finish.
I'm not cutting you short, but just to let you know, that whatever you're saying, I understand that aspect of it, because I have been in meetings at Congress and with the Department of State concerning how to work with the diaspora, the Kenyan diaspora. And I know this for a fact, because even every month they do have the Africa Brain Trust meeting with one of the congresswomen who is in charge of the Africa desk. And these meetings, they have been going on for a long time, over 10 years, 20 years. And for as long as they cannot identify it, this is the amount of money that Kenya diaspora is able to put into this. Maybe it's a power project or whatever it is that the Trump administration is interested in. Those talks are going to keep on going for a very long time. We have to show the millions and high net worth individuals we have.
Well, listen, wait, just a minute. I'm limiting my, I'm being very focused on, I guess what you said, and please don't take this in the wrong way. I don't want us to be on the sidelines because we believe that it's going to be a government-to-government transaction or agreement, and we're bystanders unless we're billionaires. That's not how this thing is going to work, number one. Number two, let me also speak to what you just said. I think the last data that I saw, the last amounts we remitted were about 300 billion shillings that we sent to, wait a minute. Oh, sorry. We sent about 300 billion shillings to Kenya. Do you know that the people that run that government in Nairobi, there's something you said at the beginning of this call, Chris, that they think it's because we're sending it to family, right? And therefore, because of that, we don't have any say so. We pay out of that 300 billion that goes to Kenya, we literally pay or spend 50 billion right off the top that goes to the exchequer, that goes in taxes, right?
In terms of the diaspora, how do you think our relationship should be when we emerge out of this, the relationship between us and our government when we come out of this gloom?
Let me start with something that happened 2 days ago on Friday to answer that question.
Yeah.
For the first time in a very long time, we had a meeting between the ambassador, the acting ambassador, the deputy ambassador in Washington, D.C., and Kenyans in the diaspora. So he called together about 50 Kenyans on Zoom. And of course, one of the main agendas was to address the current crisis, COVID-19. And in that meeting, everyone had an opportunity to say where they were, what they are doing in terms of this crisis, and figure out how to continue on helping Kenyans in the United States and fellow Kenyans in Kenya as far as this crisis goes. It was a wonderful gathering, and I wish that had been going on for a long time, but wishes aside, this is something that I hope can continue. So what this crisis has done for us, it has shown us that, we have at our disposal things that have always been have been there with us for a long time. Online meeting, Zoom. We don't need to go to the embassy to meet. It has always been the case for Kenyans to be invited to the embassy in order to meet and discuss things that pertain to our common interest. That doesn't need to be the case anymore.
David, same question.
Oh gosh, yeah. I think in all honesty, I'm not as optimistic as Kawasi is on this one because, our governments, we've already been shown how they've acted in the midst of this, So I'm hoping that beyond this, that they will honestly wake up to what this means. What's the opportunity there, and how do we leverage our position as Africans and change the dynamics or the paradigm of how we do things and do business.
I've been talking to David Ogega from Atlanta, Georgia, and Sister Mkawasi Mcharo Hall from Baltimore in Maryland. This is Diaspora Live Show, and I'll see you again next week.